Hi, we are going to be looking at now chapter 18 in Brinkley, Age of the City. This is going to be sort of the urbanization, immigration part of this Gilded Age unit, this period 6. So let's get started. Period 6, like we know, is basically this time period from post-Civil War through 1898. It makes up 13% of the test. And this period 6 is really about the growth of America from an agrarian past to an urbanized future. There's lots of changes on the economic front. Political laissez-faire made that possible. Huge amounts of transformations of the cities, people migrating from different parts of the country, and also immigrating from other countries as well to really bolster the American urbanization movement. We also see the industrialization making lives easier. We see all these different changes going on in this time period. So the AP really likes to they do a lot of focus on this time period. Typically, you'll see at least a bank of questions on this period. You will also see usually one piece of writing, either be an SAQ, LEQ, or the DBQ. Okay, so this Age of the City, Brinkley chapter 18. Here are some of the key historical skills. Again, we're looking at continuation, change over time. We're looking at how basically the immigrants will increase in volume and change the American culture. We have a historical causation, which analyzes the reasons for growth of urban problems and successes of municipal governments dealing with the problems. So it's sort of like this will piggyback right into our next story unit, which is going to be focusing on this progressive era. Also contextualization, explain how urban planners propose to physically alter environment to improve the quality of life. So the massive building project that went into this time period from the Gilded Age into the 1920s. Okay, urbanization. Well, why was this happening during this time period? You had this lure of this city. Horace Greeley basically, this famous quote, we can't all live in the cities, yet nearly all seem determined to do so. Which basically means you see this massive migration going on in this time period from the countryside, the rural area parts of the nation, into the cities. There's a lot of causes for that. One cause was the commercialization of agriculture made it harder and harder for individual farmers to make a living. And so they couldn't really make a living farming, so they were brought back into the urban area. Also, we see this massive population increase of American cities, which, again, is to do with that migration, but also immigration as well, which you have to think about the world stage, about how that was affected, and what were the reasons why we see this major push into America. Okay, so the migration we see due to increased commercialization and mechanization, American farms, like we just talked about. We also see the huge push of African Americans starting to move from the south up to the northern East Coast or the Midwest. So we see this big push mainly because of more job availability, but also because of the massive Jim Crow legislation that had been passed to make it almost unbearably able for these people to live in the South freely. So we see them flocking to the north for those two major reasons. World War I is going to be this big spurring point for this migration, obviously with huge amount of job availability, providing weapons and resources for the war. And again, you see these mechanized farms starting to dominate the plains in the old Northwest. And the migration, I guess mostly you see coming into the north, but some people moving out west as well. This is a cartoon I've seen on the AP test before about the Great Migration with the African Americans. And you also see the massive immigration of people from Europe, mostly. Again, to some extent, China and Japan, but mostly Europe. From 1865 to 1910 or 1915, we see over 30 million people immigrate to America. The reasons why, we see push and pull factors. We'll get to that in a second. And the big trend is that from the early parts of the Gilded Age, you still saw most of the population being from this old Europe, the old immigration trends of the English, the Irish, the French, the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, them being the main people coming to America. And again, of course, the rest of the world would be Asia, mostly Chinese in this time. Well, by the 1910s, we see the bulk of immigrants coming to America is from Eastern and Southern Europe, like Italy and Poland and Russian and Greece and the Jewish population from across Europe. Also, you see the banning of Chinese immigrants cutting down this 24 to 11. Okay, so the main reasons why we see Europeans wanting to come to America or why they're coming to America. Obviously, America offers freedoms. Bill of Rights, gives them certain freedoms of religion, and speech, and of law and stuff like that. We see there's no monarchy in America, so you see that we have a democracy, more voting rights for these immigrants. Typically, we don't have a major religious. We do have racism, but less religious persecution for the Jewish races. Also, the biggest reason, job availability. We have huge amounts of jobs opening up, especially unskilled labor needs. And of course, they're leaving their home countries because their countries had very little job availability outside of farming. You had a huge amount of oppression, poverty. You had monarchs and dictators. So they're coming to America for these reasons, and for the most part, we are open arms, using this labor source and using these groups as a major labor source. The trip to America was typically on a steerage or third class of a ship. Most of these ships were basically renovated like cargo ships into then human ships. Some were nice passenger liners as well, and they came over in such big numbers, again on very, very poor settings. Typically, the trip would take anywhere from, depending on the line and where you're leaving Europe, anywhere from a week to 2 weeks to get here. About 3 to 4 weeks from Asia to get here. And typically, when they got here, unless you were on a nice ocean liner, you'd be taken straight to the Immigration Processing Center, either Ellis Island or Angel Island. So in New York, we had Ellis Island. That was the main processing center in the late 80s or the late 1900s, early 1900s. And that's going to be where most European immigrants are going to be processed in the later part of the Gilded Age. In San Francisco, and basically we had Angel Island, which was the same sort of thing. I'll get into what the process centers were like in a second. But Angel Island was the equivalent. It was in San Francisco Harbor, taking mostly Japanese and Chinese people and processing them. Okay, what happened at Ellis Island? Some pictures of it. And so at Ellis Island, we see that it's the immigrants' first step off the boat. If you were rich, you were documented and processed on the ship, let off on the New York docks, you're good to go. If you were in steerage class, or basically third class, or had you were in poverty, you'd be basically processed at this processing center. You see there? So one of the very first things you did, you got the boat, very few belongings, and then you would basically be going into this big registry hall. In this registry hall, you'd be given a certain legal checks. And you'd be talking about your name and your political beliefs and your criminal past if you had one. And for the most part, everyone made it through. I mean, there was some people that were held back, but for the most part, most people made it through this process. Also, they want to know where you're going. What type of, do you have a job lined up? Because actually it was illegal to have a job lined up because of an act that was passed that companies could not hire immigrants to come and take over American workers' jobs. But they're looking also about your physicality too. Like, did you have relatives to take care of you? And then after that, you went through a medical check, where they're going to be checking for contagious diseases, typhoid fever, different other types of flus, checking for lice and other types of glaucoma or eye diseases, type of things that they could spread. And for the most part, everyone passed. Some people were denied entrance, and typically those people were just held into basically a quarantine hall or a quarantine room for a few days until they were deemed not contagious. And at that point, then you were basically either put on a ferry to New York City or put on a train to then, or a ability to go to the train to go to another part of the country. These are the stairs of separation. Basically, there's these three sets of stairs. One was going to the trains, one was going to the ferries, and one was going to be to the detention hall. But for the most part, this took 1 day of processing, and most immigrants did get processed through with very little problems. Okay, once immigrants got to America, they typically formed ghettos, these ethnic cities, these enclaves of parts of cities that were dominated by one race or one religion. And many cities like Chicago and Cincinnati and New York especially basically grew up with these very diverse neighborhoods, these ghettos, where they had Little Italies and Chinatowns and basically in Chicago, there's actually more Polish people than the capital, Poland itself. It was that drastic. And there's a lot of benefits to these ghettos, these ethnic enclaves. There's familiarity. The people spoke each other's language here. A lot of family members here. The cultural heritage was strong there. You had markets and food stores and restaurants that were from the recipes and from the food from their past countries. You had religious institutions built, in these areas that, you had Russian Orthodox churches and Greek Orthodox churches and Jewish synagogues and Catholic churches built in areas that had more predominated one race or religion. You also have problems too. Obviously, then this area was typically more of the poor area, so they're much more run down. You had these were the areas a lot of times closer to the factories, and so in many cases you had more pollution and more problems. There was more crime and not as much city spending, so the levels of upkeep and parks and schools were not as well established in these areas. Okay, the reason why most people came to America was one thing: they provided cheap, unskilled labor that was needed. So there's a huge amount of labor needs in America that needed people willing to work cheaply, but also unskilled. And so this allured many Europeans because this wage was going to be more than they can make in Europe. And these jobs, typically they could learn them without having a skill set prior to them. So they were available jobs needed. And so obviously, as more and more people flooded into America from the basically Civil War to 1900, we see that the labor conditions get worse and worse because there's a labor surplus. Basically, there was 12 hours a day at the very start, 6 days a week. Again, eventually they'll be cut down to 10 hours, but very hard labor, paid very little per year, very little attention paid to safety issues. Women and children were allowed to work, and so there was they pitted children and women labor against men because they could hire women and children much less. And again, the people that could unionize typically didn't see much benefits or much growth because most of the unions were put down or the strikes were put down, and in many cases they weren't allowed to unionize at all. These very cramped quarters. You can see some pictures. Very dangerous jobs with very little safety regulations. And many people also took work home with them, called piecework, where they would get a contract with a company that they would, for every garter belt that they sewed, or every tailor job that they did, or every thing that they made, or every pound of peanuts that they shelled, they'd get a certain amount of money coming in. So a lot of these immigrants took work home with them. And many immigrants wanted to assimilate, or there was a lot of Americans who really pushed assimilation, which is basically the merging of cultures, the basically giving up a little bit of your old culture and adopting that of the new culture. And assimilation, there's good parts and bad parts about that. Obviously, most people should assimilate to a certain extent, you could say, or it benefits them and benefits America for them to assimilate to a certain extent. But there's also this major sort of racist, nativist ideology forcing people to Americanize or assimilate. And there's a big, currently there's a lot of discussion and debate about that. The assimilation of non-Americans becoming Americans. And back in the Gilded Age, we do see, I would say, a push to rid immigrants of their ethnicity. And some immigrants wanted to do that, and some immigrants were forced that they needed to do that. Typically, the children were the ones who sort of were the most assimilated almost voluntarily. Many of them wanted to sort of almost lose their ethnic past so they could fit in more with the current children growing up. And there was, for adults, there was English classes in these settlement houses, in many cases, and there was a big push also because of the bigotry and the racist ideology of Americans looking at immigrants. You see Uncle Sam holding his nose with this immigrant, carrying all this European badge of disease and poverty and Sabbath desecration, into this gate of door. You see here Uncle Sam and Mrs. Sam, being terrorized by all these immigrants as problems, being brought to America. And for the most part, though, we didn't really do and pass many immigrant restrictions in this time period, except for the Chinese. We did pass many anti-Chinese or anti-coolie laws, are called, throughout states dealing with labor and Chinese. There was anti-housing for Chinese in many cases in San Francisco. On a more national scale, though, we did pass the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 to forbid Chinese from immigrating to America, further than they had already had in 1882. Okay, so urban landscape of this time period. Wealthy live in cities up until we start seeing more and more wealthy living on the edges of cities where it was a little cleaner, a little safer, a little less congested population-wise. And you see these suburbs where you see the wealthiest move there. What really allowed that to happen was the growth of transportation, especially subways and mass transportation from suburbs to more inner city areas where offices and factories were. You see Nob Hill in San Francisco, some richer areas, wealthy areas. You see Back Bay in Boston. Of course, Fifth Avenue in New York City. For the most part, the poor, though, were the ones who had the bulk of the city, and they lived in these ghettos. And then in those ghettos, there was these large-scale apartments built called tenements. They were horribly run down. They were put up very shoddily, very quickly, with very little attention paid to anything like I can't think of the word paid to detail when it comes to how the buildings were built.